But listen to this. He says, here are the psychological needs that war fulfills. Number one, a feeling of solidarity. A feeling of solidarity. That when we are at war, we have a real sense that everybody else is with us. It's another word for a feeling of comradeship. A feeling, number one. Number two, the need to feel audacious. All of us need to feel that we're part of a group that's solidarity. Number two is that we have to have some sense that we're bold. We don't feel fully human unless we've done something bold. All right, then I'll tell them, you don't raise my salary by 5 cents an hour, I'm quit. Well, Mom, I don't know what happened. I was just a little bit audacious. We don't need you here anymore. Certain people get away with it. I never get away with that. Or I say, you don't give me this, I'm going. They say, well, goodbye. Third, comradeship. These are William James' sense of the things, the psychological needs that are fulfilled in war. Fourth, loyalty. A terrible gangrene sets in to the human soul when we feel that we have not been loyal or others have not been loyal to us. These are brilliant insights. Next, courage. Next, courage. And then this writer goes on to say, the culture of war promotes solidarity against an enemy which is another group, another nation, another people. There always has to be someone against whom we fixate. That's war. And you know, God help us, but there is a terrible way that the way to pull a people together is to get them to have an enemy. Absolutely the most terrifying thing about being a political animal. That all of us can be so easily manipulated. So deep is our need to be a part of each other that a callous or a hypocritical leader can very easily tune us in such a way that you want to feel that you are a part of something. Just let me find who the enemy is. Colleges do that with rivalries. Notre Dame is a great college because they go against BC. Or St. John's. So it's an exception. Yeah, Chuck.
What about Walt Kelly's attitude?
About?
Who is the enemy?
That's right, there we go. Walt Kelly, good, thank you. It's us who the enemy is. That's good, thank you very much. That's beautiful. And that's really true. But, Jane.
Don't those same characteristics come about when there's a disaster? I mean, then you're a group again.
That's beautiful. Thank you very much for that. That's beautiful. A disaster is automatically an equivalent for war. The response to a disaster is automatically an equivalent for war. And we saw that with the World Trade Center. Thank you very much. That's beautiful. That's beautiful. There's a problem there. Sometimes when a disaster occurs, there's an anger which residually stays around. And the anger lasts longer than the feeling of solidarity and unity. Whereas the culture of war promotes solidarity against an enemy, which is another group, another nation, another people, the culture of peace promotes solidarity of all people against anything which is a threat to any one of them. So there's maturity for the human race. When all human beings see we're in it together, and where we weep because a child in Africa is starving, or where we weep because a child is in need of special services because the child is retarded, or we are concerned because an earthquake is taking place someplace else. And that is gradually happening. That is gradually happening. You look at the medical profession with these doctors without frontiers, they're absolutely extraordinary. wherever anything happens that threatens the well-being of people, there's a plane that takes off with MDs who give up their practice and their wealth and go and work. The Peace Corps is a part of that. What we need now is a viewpoint in which we see the other as an ally in a collective struggle which will bring we don't know what glory. So we say somehow we and the members of Islam have to get together, because if we do, something glorious will happen. Here, and this refers to, this relates to something Jack said the other day. Nonviolence in a culture of peace is not being quiet. It's an active struggle for justice, harnessing anger, being courageous, and not being afraid to be strong wherever there is injustice. And enlisting everybody we can, men and women, young and old, in the struggle against that injustice. That's beautiful. Okay. Now with that, into the Iliad, Book 19. Odyssey. I said according to the Odyssey thing.
Oh, Odyssey.
Yeah, which did I say yesterday? Did I mess those up then too? Good. Oh my God. My evaluations from students usually begin if he could get the assignments right and say what he thinks he's saying, we'd all be in much better shape. I think I'm going to start on page 299. And we have here an extraordinary book dedicated to a talk between a husband and wife who have become strangers to each other. Well, isn't that a part of the human condition? Isn't that a part of the human condition? And one of the threats of everyday life and of the stresses of everyday life is that husbands and wives do become strangers to each other. One doesn't understand the stresses the other is under. So this is corrective literature. This is correct. This is that story. You count to 40, and here it is. Homer knew the married life of people in his own time. Marriage is not a panacea for everything. You have to work at it. You have to be actively engaged in it. And here's a man that comes home for a long time, after a long time. We'll start with line 339, page 299. And Penelope, watching him carefully. That's how you know you're in the presence of your mother-in-law. She's watching you carefully. I always used to see when I would bring my wife home after dates if my mother-in-law was counting to 40 and what story I was going to get about her pew. Stranger, may your words come true. The words are that Odysseus will come back. Then, if that were to happen, you would know my kindness, and my gifts would make you blessed in all men's eyes. But I know in my heart that Odysseus will never come home, and that you will never find passage elsewhere, since there is not now any master in the house like Odysseus, if he ever existed. I don't know whether he's a figment of my dreams, to send honored guests safely on their way or to welcome them. And I want to pause just for a moment there to remind you once again that the subject of both the Iliad and the Odyssey is justice. And the first intimation of justice in the Iliad and the Odyssey is justice is served whenever a guest is welcomed a stranger is taken in. And Penelope says the crowd that are out there in the outer room don't know what it is that they're supposed to do when they're in charge of the house. That is, welcome any stranger, to send honored guests safely on their way. The honored guest here is a beggar. He's smelly, he's got lice. Or to welcome them. And then there's a beautiful thing. My great hero for the 20th century, as I've told those of you who have been here before, is a man by the name of Jean Vanier, who grew up on the Iliad, the Odyssey, and Aristotle, got a PhD in Greek philosophy, and said, I'm not a very happy person, and took two mentally disturbed adults into a house and lived with them. And now there are 120 houses worldwide in which people say we will live with those who are retarded or ill, as though they were our equals. And his latest publication is a recipe for overcoming the World Trade Center's disaster, which he says he learned from living with people who supposedly have nothing to teach us. 120 houses worldwide. And Vanier says that the church has misestimated the number of sacraments. There are actually 8. The 8th is washing the feet of others. He kindly invited me to go to his place in France, where he started the whole thing a year and a half ago. Come in and have your feet washed. I'm not very comfortable with that. I don't have pretty feet.
It's very
Have to do it.
uncomfortable.
Have to do it.
You do that. Good Friday.
But still wash our guests' feet, maidens, and prepare a bed for him. So Penelope says we've got this character here who's filthy and dirty. Get you maidservants over here and wash his feet. Set up a frame and cover it with cloaks and lustrous blankets to keep him cozy and warm. And when the morning shows her first light, bathe him and anoint him, so he can sit side by side with Telemachus, that's her son, and share in the feast here in the hall. Here's the beggar. Anyone who causes this man any pain will regret it sorely and will accomplish nothing here in this house, however angry he gets. Anger is to have no place here. The stranger is to be welcomed. In the Old Testament, when Abraham and Sarah welcomed 3 strangers in, we're told that they've actually accommodated the Trinity. And the end result of that is that Sarah becomes happy with child. So in Jewish thought also, there was this extraordinarily deep understanding, which St. Benedict makes a rule of his order, that you might think that hospitality and welcoming the stranger is an elective in life. In point of fact, it's the first act of justice. In point of fact, it's the first act of justice. For how would you ever find out, stranger, whether or not I surpass all other women in presence of mine, if you sit down to dinner squalid and disheveled here in my hall? Our lives are short. A hard-hearted man is cursed while he lives and reviled in death, but a good-hearted man has his fame spread far and wide by the guests he has honored, and men speak well of him all over the earth. So one of the reasons for hospitality is it shows you are open-hearted and warm-hearted, and it will increase your prestige. You say, well, that's not very deep, that's not a very good reason for welcoming the beggar, but anyway, there it is. Revered wife of Odysseus, son of Laertes. Odysseus is pretending he's not Odysseus himself, and that Laertes is not his father. I lost all interest in cloaks and blankets on the day I left the snowy mountains of Crete in my long lordship. Any of you who have worked with the homeless know that sometimes they don't want soft bed. Just leave me alone, will you please? And let me do it my way. Let me do it my way. as I have through many a sleepless night on a poor bed waiting for dawn, nor do I have any taste for foot baths. I'm going to wash my feet. It's like Peter, they're going to wash my feet. If I don't wash it, you don't get to be a part of who I am. Well, then wash the whole of me, Peter says to Christ. And none of the serving women here in your hall will touch my feet, unless you have some old, trustworthy woman who has suffered as I have. I would not mind if she touched my feet. And there's that little note of sadness. The only person who can encounter me, says Odysseus, is the person who has herself felt sorrow. The only person who can encounter me is the person who has herself felt sorrow. The only person who can be a good coach is the person who has known terrible failure. And the only person who can teach well is the person who has had all sorts of pain in his or her own life, so that he or she can be aware of and sensitive to that when it occurs in students. Unless there is some old, trustworthy woman who has suffered as I have, I would not mind if she touched my feet. And Penelope, watching him carefully, said, of all the travelers who have come to my house, none, dear guest, has been as thoughtful of you, and none as welcome. So wise are your words. I do have an old and trustworthy woman here who nursed and raised my ill-starred husband, taking him in her arms the day he was born. She will wash your feet, frail as she is. Euryclea, rise and wash your master's feet. Some Freudian slip there. And that is, wash the feet of this man who is your master's age. Odysseus's feet are no doubt like his now, for men age quickly when life is hard. At this the old woman hid her face in her hands, shedding warm tears, and she spoke through her sobs. She's addressing Odysseus. She doesn't know that Odysseus is in front of her. My lost child, I can do nothing for you. Zeus must have hated you above all other men, although you were always God-fearing yourself. No one burned more offerings to the Lord of Lightning, so many fat thigh bones, bulls by the hundreds, with prayers that you reach a sleek old age and graze your glorious son. And now the God has deprived you alone of your day of return. And there's that sense there that if you are observant of the divine, you will have a life that will not have as much pain as people who are not observant of the divine. And yet, as she says, it doesn't seem to have worked that way. It's the question of Job. Why do good people suffer? Homer doesn't know to ask that in a systematic way, but it's in there. Why does it happen that people who are good sometimes suffer more than people who are not? And then she turns and says, and I suppose, stranger, women mocked Odysseus too, when he came to some man's gloried house in distant land, just as these cheeky bitches all mock you here. And the maid woman has an insight that Penelope, Odysseus' wife, doesn't have. The nurse gets it. She says, I know why you don't want them to wash your feet. It's not because they're young and pretty, it's because you can't stand them because of the way they're betraying you by sleeping with the suitors who are outside there. That's not humility on your part. You are really ticked off. And this is supposed to be an anger that's correct justice, by the way. Skip down to about line 416. And Odysseus answered her, oh, everyone who has seen us says that I look like Odysseus, because he's the beggar. Old woman, they say that we are very much alike, just as you yourself have noticed. And the scene that follows now, just the next couple of lines, in a very famous book called Mimesis by Eric Auerbach, Auerbach. There's this particular scene that we're about to see is the key to the whole of the Odyssey and maybe even the Greek literature. And it's one that we all know, and it's common to us all as human beings. To be human is to be scarred. There's no one in here who doesn't have some kind of a scar, physical or psychological, spiritual or mental. And there are some theologians who say that what the judgment is in the next world is showing our scars. Saying, yes, I have suffered and I didn't push back, or this is a scar from working hard for something good. And we know that in the moment after the resurrection, a central passage is Christ coming back and showing Thomas the scars. So there's something very important going on here. And the old woman took the shining basin she used for washing feet, poured cold water into it, then added the hot. That's delicious, isn't it? Even 800 BC, they knew not to step into a shower and turn the hot water on in the Holiday Inn before you don't go to the edge of the thing. It'll probably scald the living daylights out of it. So she poured the cold water into it and then added the hot. I want to stop just for a moment here. You read the Odyssey and you read the Iliad because we could discover ourselves in those books. And because they're good of and in themselves, and because they're good stories. There's another reason to read them, and that is the little reference I made to Eric Auerbach. Some of the best writers now at work in our own civilization use the Iliad and the Odyssey as a part of the argument for everything they say. Just as Simone Weil says to Hitler, you're wrong, and the Iliad proves you're wrong in that wonderful essay, The Iliad Poem of Force. There are extraordinary writers who use the Iliad and the Odyssey as the cornerstones of their argument for whatever they're arguing about. So Auerbach in that book, Mimesis, says you can't understand what literary theory is all about until you first encounter the Iliad and the Odyssey. I told Jack there's another writer I might look at by the name of John Donne, who says you can't understand psychology unless you encounter the Iliad and the Odyssey. The head doctor for Bush's program on the morality of genetics is a medical doctor from the University of Chicago by the name of Leon Cass. His books are the books I've used most frequently throughout my teaching career. He's a thoroughgoing rationalist. But he spent almost every year of his life when he's not in medicine teaching the Iliad and the Odyssey at the University of Chicago. And he's just written a brilliant book called In the Beginning, which is a study of the Bible. He and his wife wrote it together. And it's based not on his faith experiences, but on he says, 30 years of teaching the Bible in classes with 20 or 25 undergraduates at the University of Chicago. Half of the book is about the Iliad or the Odyssey. He says, well, in the New Testament, somebody is crucified outside the walls of Jerusalem. At Troy, somebody is killed outside the walls. There are strange similarities between Greek literature and Christian literature, and it raises an incredible question, which is one of the most famous questions of our civilization. Here's the question. It's Tertullian. What has Jerusalem to do with Athens? You get Father Durkin talking on that and he won't stop for 6 hours. What has Jerusalem to do with Athens? Once you have a religious faith, if you have a religious faith, why do you need anything else? Why do you need anything else? Once you have a religious faith, why do you need anything else? Well, the answer of Western civilization is you do need something else. Why is that? What is there about God's way in which he has managed the world that he has spoken to other people besides those that he most directly speaks to through Christ? And once you ask that question, you might ask, what does Jerusalem have to do with Beijing? Or what does Jerusalem have to do with Baghdad? It's a way of saying, what can I find in other cultures that have value? Yes, I know I'm well grounded in my own religious faith, but that doesn't mean I have to close my eyes and walk through life as though nothing else counted. And you see, yesterday when I drew that picture of the fish on the board, that the earliest Christians adopted the language and the symbolism of the society in which they were founded. They disguised themselves with that little fish pin, ichthus. But for them it meant Jesus Christ, the Son of God and Savior. But it looked as though they were just joining in the thought of the time that the sea was something important. So what has Jerusalem to do? If you type in, oh, by the way, I did this morning. The question, what has Jerusalem to do with Athens, on Google, elicits 90,000 websites dealing with that problem.
Oh my word.
The question, I typed in, what has Jerusalem to do with Athens? It's on the computer now, you can see it after class. I don't want to turn that blue light on again. The question, I just typed in, what does Jerusalem have to do with Athens? 90,000 websites are concerned with that question. It's an incredibly important question. Once I have a religious faith, do I then close my eyes and say I don't want to look at anybody else? Or once I have found value in the Psalms or the New Testament, then do I close my mind to even stories about people who kill each other like the Iliad? If you do, it's at your peril. And the old woman took the shining basin she used for washing feet, poured cold water into it, then added the hot. And Odysseus, waiting, suddenly sat down at the hearth and turned away from the shadows. The scar. It flashed through his mind that his old nurse would notice his scar as soon as she touched him. And then everything would be out in the open. She drew near and started to wash her master. And knew at once the scar. At its profoundest level, that passage tells us that we know others through their scars and ours. At its profoundest level, that passage tells us that for a human being to know another human being, there has to be between them a recognition of scars. And I suppose that within the family you're aware of those scars. And so when one teacher says to you, your child is a rat bag or doesn't belong in school or something, and you know all the things your child has gone through, you run to the child's defense because you know the scars and the teacher doesn't. You say, wait a minute, this kid's been through a rough time. He's stuttered for 5 years. Give him a chance to speak out a little bit easily if he feels comfortable enough in your room. But there are all sorts of ways in which we are most at home with those whose scars we know and who know our scars. Marriage in many ways is a sharing of scars. I know that that's what parenting is all about. And that wonderful Van Doren story when the kid is accused of perjury and the father comes up and stands beside him. So your scar is my scar. That's who we are. He knew at once the scar from the wound he had gotten long ago from a boar's white tusk when he had gone